and lovely to be here. Do we have, oh, we do. Oh, right, let's go back. Good. Right, it's death by PowerPoint, and lovely to see you all. I always think the LGA Conference is like a sort of large extended family wedding where you see many relatives that you haven't seen for a while, and it's got that really nice feel to it. So it's great to be here. I realise I first stood on this stage, I think it was the LGA, but I've certainly spoken at many LGA conferences over the last 30 years. So it's lovely to be back and to see so many people that I can remember. I now live mostly in Paris, and we'll talk about that and a little bit about Brexit. But the key issue today really is trying to make some space to think a bit about what might come next. And it is worth saying that I looked back at things that I'd talked about here before. Back in 2008, I was talking about uncertainty over our economies, global competition and welfare state models, growing concerns about energy and the environment, a culture of fear on immigration, celebrity culture and instant gratification, national and generation gaps, the ongoing march of technology, older and fatter, and who's going to pay, a new contract between states and cities and devolutions. Some of it starts to sound a little bit familiar. And I think perhaps if I leave you with nothing else, when you're thinking about how you go about things, either locally or together, let's remember Einstein. The greatest insanity is to keep doing the same things over and over again and expecting something different to happen. And if we have a national central government who sometimes feel like they're a campaigning organisation rather than a government, this might mean that we really need to push to make some space to reflect. It's also true, I think, that predicting the future, and we've been asked to look at the 2020s, is quite hard. This is the Daily Mail back in 2000 predicting that the internet was just a passing fad. But I can show you thousands of mostly men, but also women, making crazy predictions about the future. The IBM executive who in the 1940s predicted that the world might need about 4 or 5 computers. The man at Decca who turned down the Beatles in the early 1960s because guitar groups were on their way out. We can just find so many. Look at the central bankers with whom I work in Basel at the Bank of International Settlements. Look at what they were saying about inflation. They have all the data, some of the most highly paid people in the world working for them, and their predictions on inflation in January 2021 compared to what they're saying about what's going to happen to inflation now. So predicting the future is hard. Opinion pollsters can do a very good job on Tuesday before an election, but we do have to get to the Tuesday. But overall, 2027 will be different in many ways, and of course, in many other ways, I suspect it will be remarkably similar. But, when you look at some of the forecasts, this was an LGA forecast on 10 years ago on council expenditure, and of course, the amount of money for anything other than social care rapidly declining. Turned out to be quite prescient. Add in some inflation to wages, etc., the ageing population, you'll have seen in the census that we now have well over 500,000 people in this country who are over 90, which we should celebrate. But at the same time, of course, that trend is only going to continue. 10 years ago, what were we talking about? So there was the Commission on the Future of Local Government, civic entrepreneurs, 21st century infrastructure, a new social contract, okay? A few years later, devolving transport powers, devolving skills funding. There's a consistent pattern of this conference talking about devolution and central government doing whatever it does. So what might be the issues we'd think about? I mean, politically, fascinating. This is 2012. George Osborne had just fallen behind Ed Balls as the most capable chancellor in the Mori polls. Economic optimism was continuing to fall. The Conservatives had their lowest rating in 5 years. And there's the vote share, 31% for the Conservatives, 40% for Labour. So maybe, what was going to happen at the next election? Well, let's just now look at today. So there's the charts. Compare the two charts. Here's today, 33% for the Conservatives, 39% for Labour. Some things don't change as much as you might think. 7 in 10 Britons expect the economy to get worse over the next 12 months. Labour leading the Conservatives by 15 points as the party most trusted to deal with the cost of living. So you tell me what's going to happen next. That will be interesting. So certainly, we need to be very careful about forecasting. History does not repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. And I think if we can't predict the future, and if you can, come and see me, but the war in Ukraine, etc., etc. I wouldn't. If you told me 12 months ago I'd have a Ukrainian refugee living with me, what would that be about? I do. But I think if we think a bit more and make time, and I know that's difficult when we're all faced with short-term challenges over budgets. How on earth are we going to meet the numbers that we need to meet this year? But we do need to step back, and we need to make space to think about the future. And I want to offer you today a few provocations about some things that might be coming up. So I'll look at how we might think about that, and I think there are ways of being structured about that, and they don't need, also, you'll be pleased to hear, they don't need to cost a lot of money, so that's good. Secondly, what are those tensions and uncertainties, and we'll talk about those today. They're massive, and we've already seen in the last 24 months just how much change can happen really, really quickly. And if anything, I would say the only certainty about the 2020s is literally uncertainty. And then what might we do, what will that actually mean in terms of day-to-day delivery in 2027? The people, most of the people that you will be serving in 2027 are already there, they're living there. And so I will offer you some provocations from the report, which you can also pick up with a QR code around the conference venue. And I think the first thing is also that change really is driven at sort of different levels. So I would encourage you to think about those macro forces, those things that we are dead certain about: demography, climate change. And those are very, they are almost unstoppable. Then we have shifts that we often measure in our research. Public attitudes changing. You might include in that how, for example, during my lifetime we have moved on homosexuality from it being illegal when I was born to 2/3 of people now saying if Prince Harry had married a man rather than Meghan Markle, they'd been absolutely fine with that. Meghan Markle might have been happier as well. So we don't know. And then, of course, we've got those signals that we can see out there in the high street, that we can see when you go into work, or when you go into work and there's nobody there. Those are the things happening now. They're real-world examples. Now, these things all interact with each other. The macro, you could take, if you go to Greggs and order your vegan sausage roll for lunch, that, in a sense, is a signal of a deep-rooted change, people getting concerned about the amount of meat they're eating, some people worried about the impact that meat production has on the planet, and so it's those long-term forces, and then suddenly Greggs is offering a vegan sausage roll, and Piers Morgan is terribly upset, or trying to be controversial. So these things, there are feedback loops, of course, because if human beings, in response to something, all start changing, then of course that drives further change. But being structured about the deep-rooted things is important. And so the macro forces are pretty clear-cut. We know, for example, there will be more Nigerians than Europeans in a few short years. If climate change and temperature rises carry on, just as one example, the migration challenges that Europe faces at the moment are going to be magnified dramatically. We know that the Italians, I don't know if there are any Italians in the room, but there will be no more Italians in 170 years at their current birth rate. Italian women have decided that Italian men are really far too much bother, and the birth rate is falling. So they are going to be, we can predict with certainty, the Italians will be the oldest country on earth. Currently Japan, where of course adult nappies massively outsell child nappies, but Italy is going the same way, unless they decide that immigration is a solution for them. Growing inequality and opportunity. We should remind ourselves that globally, globalization has lifted billions of people out of poverty over the last 30 years. The challenge is how it's played out for people in these islands here, and indeed across Europe and America. And I think one of the biggest trends in my work has been the data that's changed in the time that I've been coming to speak occasionally at this conference. back at the beginning of this century, only about 1 person in 10 in Britain expected that their children would be poorer than them, that the end result would be their kids would end up poorer than them. Before the pandemic, that number had risen to nearly half the population of Britain expecting their children to be poorer than them. And that is a massive psychological shift in a country where 9 out of 10 of us believe that the natural state of affairs in the United Kingdom is that each generation is richer than the previous one. That was the post-war experience overall. And now we're in this world where not only in Britain, but also across Europe, also across North America, and potentially, and which is why Latin America is the center of world populism, you have a world where people don't think things are going to get better, they're going to get worse. They don't want an enabling government like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair talked about in the last century. They want a government that will stop things. They will stop steel dumping. They will stop migration. They will protect us. They will make sure that we have money, etc., etc. So those are some real challenges. Geopolitical tensions I don't even need to talk about, except China is no longer a competitor for the major Western powers. It is an adversary. And once you understand that, a lot of things start to fall into place. Deep tech, hugely important. The rise of nanomaterials, obviously AI, smart grids, all of those things together lead to technology tipping points. And if you want to see how those manifest themselves, think of an Uber. Uber disrupted taxi models, but it required satellites. After the invention of satellites, it requires the invention of the internet. After the invention of the internet, it requires mobile phones. But suddenly, satellites, internet, mobile phones, you've got a brand new business model. And suddenly, taxi services are completely changed forever. And so in the 2020s, the person who may live to be 1,000 may get born somewhere in California. We will learn how, with the deep tech and the biotechnology changes that are coming, to change the aging of the mitochondria in the cells. They won't age in the same way, and it could happen. And then, of course, underlying all of this is the fragile planet, which we all talk about. I think we are moving to more action, although it's worth saying that, things like COVID, which is a zoonotic disease, the same as SARS, the same as MERS, the same as AIDS, they're all diseases, and measles, in fact. They all originally come from animals. And as we encroach on animal environments around the world, you will get more exposure to pathogens that previously we wouldn't have met as humanity. And so, we can see those things. Don't think that, the pandemic was just a sort of thing that happened and we'll get over it and it's gone. We need to be conscious of that. So those are things that we know, those are known knowns. So what does that mean for your population? And in fact, the diversity of the UK population is something that is pretty much a known known. But it means that this room, which already looks very different than when I was first here in the last century, will look very different again in another 20 years. And overall, if you look at, say, if you do some demography, it's interesting, outside London now, school age diversity, and remember the average school age diversity in England, 32.5% of people at school in Britain today are not white British. They're from somewhere else. Their parents are from somewhere else. And so we're seeing, look at the proportion of white British kids in Newcastle, Manchester, Stoke, Derby. Interestingly, gentrification in Hackney North and Tottenham is actually sending bits of London the other way. But overall, for Britain will become more diverse. And for those people who voted for Brexit, they might be surprised to learn that Brexit is actually making Britain more diverse more rapidly than staying in the European Union. Because migration, which of course is still pretty high, now doesn't come as much from Europe, but it comes more from Asia. So Britain will be more diverse. And I think that's really interesting in terms of what our councillors look like in future, but what our workforce looks like and what expectations are like. We also, of course, potentially have, although we've just talked about the population growing in the latest census figures, now at 67 million in the UK as a whole, overall, if you read my good colleague Daryl Bricker's book, Empty Planet, the United Nations forecasts on global population have generally been too pessimistic in terms of the overall numbers. And actually, if you look back, some of us in this room are old enough to remember the 1960s and 70s, where, of course, we were predicting at that point, cheerfully, by 2000, we'd have run out of food, we'd have run out of precious metals, it would have been mass starvation, and we did it. The trouble with that thinking is that it also means many people now think, oh, well, climate change, yeah, well, last century I was worried about starvation, didn't happen, so climate change, we'll find a way. But overall, if you look at the sort of forecasts, generally now they're being reduced down. Britain won't be quite as full, and many countries, only Africa will be growing in the second half of this century. Everywhere else we'll start to see declining populations, as we're seeing, of course, in Japan already, where they're literally ploughing villages back into the ground. And that ultimately will maybe our saving, but we've got to get there in the first place. And of course, I need you to look after me while I live to be 110. So what are the shifts that we can see and how might they affect you? And these are some ideas to reflect on. I mean, I think the first thing is people are going to feel poorer. And at the moment, we've got nearly 6 out of 10 Britons expecting their disposable income to fall. If you just do the math on the fuel prices, the fact that wage settlements in both the private and public sector are running massively behind inflation, the fact that interest rates are forecast to level out at about 2 to 3%. That's what the central bankers are saying at the moment, although haven't been perfect before, so heaven forfend if it's higher, but 2 to 3% is considerably more interest for the minority of people who have mortgages than they do at the moment. Certainly incomes will be squeezed. We're pretty pessimistic. This is asking people every month, as we do, whether you think the country, is the economy going to grow or shrink? You can see, I would also cheer us up in one way. You can see we're pretty miserable at the moment, about as miserable as we were in 1980 or in 2008. But it's also worth saying that the British are pretty pessimistic nearly all the time. If you look at the long boom when Gordon Brown used to stand up and talk about endless quarters of successive growth, and all through that period the British are saying, oh, it's going to go wrong next year, it's going to go wrong next year. But nevertheless, minus 62 is bad. We are feeling pretty pessimistic at the moment. And I think one interesting thing then is in terms of government, where government, of course, we've got some of the highest taxes now in 40 years, a big boost in spending on the health service. What do people want? And so a long-term series here, you can see this is the proportion of people who say that we should actually put taxes up and spend more. We've still got half the population saying that. And then, of course, you can see here's just to sort of keep things the same, and then cutting taxes, spend less, never particularly popular. But overall, the proportion, we can see that period running up to the 2019 election, the years after the austerity years, which of course many of you have lived through, massive cuts in central grant to local government. We can see that the proportion wanting to see tax rises has gone up, and now it seems to be starting to level back. And of course, this is a lagging indicator. So I think at the moment people are sort of split. We've got 3 in 10 saying we should spend more after the coronavirus, even if it means higher levels of tax and higher public spending. You've got another 30% the same after as it had before, despite all of the challenges. And then a quarter, John Redwood, lower taxes and lower public borrowing, even if it means lower levels of public spending. So most people still like spending money, even if they're going to feel under the cosh. So it's finely balanced. And of course, our politics remains finely balanced. When we ask people, of course, what are our priorities for public spending after COVID-19, you can see, of course, the health service at the top. Social care, which we should definitely try and brand as something to do with local government, does quite well. But when we look at things like local authority services, such as waste collections and parks, not seen as such a big thing. So in some ways, you could argue, actually, the public get what they want. All the money goes on health and social care, not much on anything else. Well, Bob's your uncle. There it is, But generally, poor old local government doesn't do particularly well. And people, of course, despite being more satisfied with local government, always, in the entire 35 years I've done this job, always more satisfied than with central government, don't necessarily want to have fiscal devolution, local tax-raising powers or anything else. They sort of like the idea of more control, but when you get into the nitty-gritty, it starts to get a bit different. So what might happen? And we're looking now only at 5 years' time. And I do very much feel that somebody will be standing here with PowerPoint in a conference hall like this in 5 years' time. It tends to happen in, in every sector. But what might happen? So here are 5 starters from the new report that you can download online. And thank you to the LGA for asking us to do this. So the first thing is, if we are not able to compete with people with deep pockets, and even as a relatively successful global PLC in 90 countries, one of my major challenges, how do I compete with Google for talent? Google is my biggest client by far, but how do I compete with them for the best coders, the best data engineers, etc.? And I can't offer the same wages. I can offer perhaps something else. So I think that might be something we need to reflect on. We need to attract staff. We need to retain some staff. To use all of the new technologies that are coming down the track. I think it's been amazing how we've been able to pivot in this sector, as in so many, to hybrid working in ways that we wouldn't have thought about 5 years ago. The technology was virtually ready and has got a bit better since, but we didn't really think about that. I now employ people all over Britain that I wouldn't have done before, some of whom never come to London, where most of our big offices are, because actually it works. So how do we do that? At the same time, of course, big challenges over pay. But what else can you offer people? Do you need all of those rules? Can you give people more freedom and flexibility in terms of how they work and when they work? There's lots of intangibles, as well as, of course, one of those things that particularly motivates younger workers, believing that the organisation they're working for makes a difference. Purpose matters, particularly for younger workers. Can we try and get some people through that? But really thinking about what your employee brand is going to be hugely important if you're to take advantage of some of the technology that's coming down the track. Children. You're almost the front line of people who've had a severely disrupted educations. I mean, this is like living through a world war in terms of some of the things that have happened. There's absence of good learning in some cases, and increased mental health challenges. We need to be a little bit careful about mental health because we're more sensitive to it. It's been a number of those changes, along with being more liberal about homosexuality. We've also become much more, the taboo on mental health has rapidly changed in Britain over the last 15 years. But nevertheless, we have a generation who've had disrupted educations. We have people now who say things like, I said, we've got to see some clients on Thursday. I don't come to the office on Thursdays. It's not my anchor day. Sorry. It's like, these people pay us. We need money. So how are you supporting those people? What's it going to look like as we go through? And so we've got often a more diverse group of younger people, often shrinking in many parts of the UK. And, of course, those unknown impacts, which are really only unrolling now in terms of what that means in terms of their life chances. We already have a problem with young men, not young women, but particularly young men in terms of their dropping out after 18. We've made huge progress on NEETs since the 1990s, but certainly this really needs reflection if you're a top-tier council. The digital high street. We've got business is rapidly recasting itself. Bad retailers are going bust. Good retailers will provide experiential things in localities. It won't completely change. But certainly, how do we support people? What sort of online solutions might we offer to encourage people? Business is thinking increasingly about omnichannel or the metaverse, selling, it doesn't really matter whether they're selling physically or digitally. It's all the same and it's blended together. What does that mean for us? We know that in many major city centres, we're likely to see a permanent weekday fall in footfall. People really don't want to go back to 5 days a week, an hour on a train, expensive food, etc., etc., etc. We can see the private sector reinventing retail as we go along. How does this work for town centres? What with the ageing population? How do we get landlords to provide more housing? How do we revitalise these places? We've done amazing things. There are amazing examples that you can see of success around the UK, and of course you can see plenty of disasters. So again, what's it really going to look like by 2027? Because a key statistic on this, if you don't, and I'd strongly recommend anybody you're using or working with in your teams to keep up with the Benedict Evans blog. He writes about digital. 60% of the economy is open to being digitised and has yet to be. And so if we think that online shopping has reached its peak, or online services have reached their peak, we are still only just beginning. And what does that mean for actual places? Power. We need to change our power grid. If we're just going to meet our targets on electric cars, the street charging challenge is only going to get bigger. And I think the thing I hadn't grasped until we did the work on the report is how much bigger, roughly 4 times bigger, a green electricity grid is in terms of taking up space. So how are you going to use that space? You're in charge of space. Again, do you want to run an energy company? Recent experience would suggest you probably don't. But at the same time, do you want to get involved in storing electricity as part of a smart grid? Will you generate some electricity? And I think that's, that need to meet net zero, and with you as a significant landowner and somebody in a way, and control, making those real decisions about what happens with space. It may not, you've got more power sometimes than you realise. What is all that going to play out like by 2027 and beyond? And then, of course, materials. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to be able to start a large mobile phone manufacturing business in this country and just drill for all our rare earths here. But one of the things, again, when I was at Davos earlier this year, it was interesting to hear the Americans' Secretary of State for Trade talking about working with their friends. They want to reshore supplies to friends, not to China and Russia. At the moment, some of the key things we need for the digital revolution, for the green revolution, for the grid, all of those things for electric cars are concentrated in our geopolitical adversaries. So how are we going to do friend shoring? That's a big challenge for the UK government, friend shoring, but it might also mean that actually some of the things that we had previously considered as non-viable are now viable. Do you want to go down to your local tip and see what's there in terms of electrical waste that might actually be recyclable? Because fracking in America is a fantastic example. Completely ignored when oil was cheap and easily available, and then suddenly, of course, the amount of money spent on developing fracking and allowing America to become independent on energy supplies of pretty much anywhere else has been 10 times more than they've spent on renewables. And you can, in some ways you can see the result. But of course that wasn't the oil and gas that they're fracking in the United States. And again, I'm not proposing fracking because that might be a bit controversial, but certainly it's just interesting to see how that resource suddenly became viable. So what things do we have that we might be able to take advantage of as prices change? And they're only in many cases going upwards. So all of this, what does it mean for the Council in 2027? Well, I think some big challenges. I think, again, the risk is, of course, that we're so busy looking at the near term that we forget the longer term. And, of course, as Bill Gates, it's often misattributed to Bill Gates. It's actually somebody else. We underestimate the impact of changes in the short term. We overestimate the impact of changes in the short term. We underestimate them in the long term. But taking a step back together and really reflecting on some of these issues might be a good idea. So I think we can't predict the future, but we can prepare better. And COVID teaches us that, to be quite honest. We could have been much, much better equipped. That idea of resilience and building in some redundancy and capacity is something that is being rapidly reappraised, both in the private sector and the public sector around the world. We have, of course, multiple possible outcomes. I don't know exactly what the world will be like in 2027. I can tell you a bit about the population, perhaps. But I think looking at what is probable and really working through those issues really, I think, helps us. I mean, we don't have to go back to the extending a graph of doom into the future and thinking about when we've sold every single park or something like that. But we do need to plan. And I suggest having a conversation. What's the preferable future that you would like together? Local government, despite all of its fiscal challenges, is still the sector that has, in some ways, more people, more creativity, more understanding about what's happening at locality in this country, and the possibility of a different future. And we see that in spots around the country. The question is how you might do all of that together. And can local government perhaps just take a bit more control? That means you agreeing on some things. Britain does this sometimes. We have fixed pensions. We had a cross-party agreement that we all needed to pay a bit more, work a bit longer. The change that had made you have to opt into a pension, which Mrs. Thatcher introduced, was reversed by David Cameron, so you had to opt out of a pension. All of that has had a positive effect. The London Challenge in Education. When I started work in the 1980s, London schools were a disaster. And actually, with some money, some investment, and a change in mindset and expectations, London schools became some of the best in Britain. What could we do if we did more together? I will shut up. Thank you.